supervise these services, and most importantly, it is the social workers, street-level workers, who are often dealing with the immediate and personal reaction of individuals to organizational decisions. So the social worker is, in fact, the person on the ground dealing directly with the people who are impacted by these policies. Why are the Hannon files important for looking at the early profession of social work? Well, in particular, there's very little information. We know a lot about many of the famous social workers, Jane Addams, Mary Richmond. We don't really know nearly as much about the day-to-day lives of these early social workers, especially those who worked with older adults. So the Hannon records offer a unique glimpse into their lives. We can actually observe through the case files these visitors encountering people in a variety of circumstances, and as they develop these street-level policies and procedures. And we also gain insight into how, within broad constraints, the visitors were able to exercise influence over the lives of countless individuals during the Great Depression. So just to give you a notion of this, and the idea of the soft cop, the idea that it's a dilemma, especially with these early social workers, needing to have a soft approach, but also needing to establish certain expectations and enforcing certain policies. And this is a quote from a woman, we call her Mrs. Drake, who had actually been a music teacher at a local music store, a teacher of stringed instruments, and had lost that job and was quite poor and destitute. She was very much wanting to maintain her autonomy, as you might expect, and actually, in addition to Hannon funds, sought out support from the Masonic organization and received that help. What was happening, however, was that the Hannon Foundation had a very strict rule that all sources of outside financial support be disclosed to Hannon. She had run afoul of this rule by not disclosing her financial support to Hannon, and the result was some very unpleasant interactions with Mrs. Slack, who was the visitor. And this is Mrs. Drake's quote. This being this disclosure of the support from the Masons, this instantly started a fire for me to burn up the next day by being called over the phone to face Mrs. Slack for a case of dishonesty, which Mr. Frost, who was Mrs. Slack's superior, called it, and was extremely angry and rough with me in every respect. I was too well known here for such talk as that. It was disgraceful the way he treated me, worse than a dog. Okay, so imagine, you can imagine probably times in your life when perhaps you have suffered some loss of status, maybe a loss of a job or a loss of a partner. And imagine then dealing with this loss, and then to encounter a social worker, someone whose job it is to scrutinize your financial position. Imagine how difficult and distressing that must be. And that is what Mrs. Drake and many of the other clients were encountering during this time. On the other side, the visitors were oftentimes coping with very difficult situations. As the story proceeds, Mrs. Drake ultimately, they're able to negotiate a shared financial arrangement with the Masons and with the Hannon Foundation, but then for financial reasons, the Masons decide they are no longer able to financially support Mrs. Drake, and she deteriorates partly as a consequence of this. And this is the visitor's perception of about a month or two later after losing the Masons' funds. The visitor was quite shocked at the change in Mrs. Drake's physical appearance. She's lost a great deal of weight and did not look at all well. Mrs. Drake came into the room crying and was almost hysterical. She said that she could not stand the treatment she had been receiving and added that she had been hungry most of the month. Mrs. Drake, and here's where you kind of see the visitor's perception in the case notes. The case notes are infused with, they are written from the perspective of the visitor. Mrs. Drake did not for an instant admit that she had not been absolutely fair in her dealings with the home. She talked at length in order to attempt to justify herself and the action that she took. So you see here a conflict, a conflict developing between the visitor and Mrs. Drake, the woman who is experiencing these many stresses in her life. ultimately what happens, I don't think we have time for me to read this entire quote, but basically the relationship with this particular visitor deteriorates so much that ultimately they transfer the case to a different visitor. And as part of this, Mrs. Drake is making several references to the salaries of the social workers and saying that none of these workers could get along if their incomes had been cut in half as hers has been. So really almost like a status comparison saying, you know, you could not, those of you who are the visitors, could not possibly get on as I have. And making reference to her status as a person born in Detroit and therefore deserving of adequate financial support. So as I mentioned, these really are among the first geriatric social workers who we have the privilege of having the records of. And really, Mr. Frost himself, who was the supervisor, executive secretary at this time, he also had a social work background, a background in human services. And really, it is the visitors and the social workers who are perhaps among the best positioned to make broader policy-related statements. And so this is Mr. Frost in a quote in the Detroit Free Press in 1930. It has been said recently that those in dire need should, when old, be made comfortable among friends and relatives, so that they may spend their declining years as members of the community. While increasing age only too often brings infirmity of a physical nature, this is not by any means universally the case. So at this point, Mr. Frost is in a position to really start developing the philosophy or the ethic of community care for older adults that really would form the basis of what we have today, the emphasis on helping older adults to remain in their own home. Interestingly, Mr. Frost at various times argues against having Mrs. Drake's developmentally disabled brother live at home and arguing that he should be placed in an institution, namely Eloise, where he can receive care. So while at the same time Mr. Frost seems supportive of older adults living in the community, he in some ways reflected the prevailing belief that those with disabilities should remain in institutions. And of course that, the fight for disability rights would continue through the 1960s and 70s and up into the present day. So what are as we look to the past and look to our history, what are some of the issues that are enduring that we can learn from a review of the geriatric social workers? Some of you might recognize a little boy in the picture. The stress and workload on the visitors, the overwhelming amount of work that certainly continues, the financial constraints both on the agency's part as well as on the part of the visitors, gender issues, the fact that the visitors were primarily female. Oftentimes, even to this day, the men who are in the social work profession are more likely to be promoted to positions of administration, more so than the women. The continuing need to gain legitimacy for the social work profession. The idea of family preservation, that families should be promoted and encouraged if that is their choice to remain as a family unit and not to be placed in other settings, including institutional settings. The link to policy issues and the idea that those who are the street-level workers and the people who are on the ground delivering services are in a position to promote and make policy and should be in decision-making roles at the state and federal levels. And then finally, the role for older adults in a modern society, and our continued discussion of how can we promote financial security for older adults through a number of different policies and programs.
So I'll go ahead and apologize to the group that we're going to go over time. My name is Heather Dillaway, and I'm in sociology, and Chastity Bailey-Fakori is also just as much a part of this as I am, and so we switch back and forth in terms of authorship. We're both as much a part of it as each other. So everybody in the Hannon Archive research group has sort of taken a certain perspective